1960s didn't just produce great rock albums, it produced albums that changed what music was allowed to be. These 10 records didn't just sell. They shifted culture, rewired expectations, and built the foundation that everything after them was constructed on. Let's get into it. 10. Electric Ladyland. Jimi Hendrix took complete creative control of this record. And the result was the most ambitious thing he ever put his name to, a double album that sprawled across blues, psychedelia, jazz, and rock. In ways that had no precedent and have had no real equal since. The sessions were chaotic by every account, running through the night with a rotating cast of musicians and engineers who weren't always sure what they were making until it was finished. Hendrix was notoriously difficult to work with during this period, not out of malice, but out of a perfectionism so intense that it made conventional studio discipline impossible to maintain around him. Producer Eddie Kramer has described sessions where Hendrix would spend hours on a single guitar overdub, chasing a sound that existed fully formed in his head and refusing to stop until the tape matched what he was hearing internally. The album went to #1 in the UK and performed strongly in America despite running to over 80 minutes at a time, when double albums were still considered a commercial risk rather than a standard format. The cover art featuring Hendrix surrounded by naked women generated controversy that the label used as promotional fuel rather than trying to manage. 9. Revolver. The Beatles made this record at the exact moment when they had decided that touring was finished and the studio was the only space that mattered anymore. Making each day of the year. And the freedom that decision gave them is audible in every track. George Martin and engineer Jeff Emmerich, who was only 19 years old during the sessions, developed recording techniques that had never been tried before, including running tape machines at half speed to create sounds that the available technology wasn't supposed to be capable of producing. Emmerich has written extensively about the atmosphere in the studio during those sessions: competitive, focused, and operating with a shared understanding that they were making something genuinely new rather than repeating what had already worked. Paul McCartney's Eleanor Rigby sat next to John Lennon's Tomorrow Never Knows on the same album, which tells you everything about the range the band was operating across simultaneously. Tomorrow Never Knows alone would have been enough to secure the album's place in history, built on a single droning chord, with Lennon's vocal processed through a speaker to sound like the Dalai Lama chanting from a mountaintop. It arrived in 1966 and pointed directly at the next decade of experimental music without apology. 8. Led Zeppelin First. This was recorded in 36 hours across 9 days, which remains one of the most extraordinary production timelines for a debut album of this ambition and complexity in rock history. Good times, bad times, you know I've had my share. The band had been playing together for only a matter of weeks when they went into the studio, which means the rawness in the recording is literal rather than manufactured. These were musicians still discovering what they were capable of doing together, and the energy of that discovery is what you hear on every track. Jimmy Page produced the album himself, which was unusual for a debut act and reflected both his extensive session musician experience and his very specific vision for how the band's sound should be captured. Atlantic Records signed them for what was then a record-breaking advance without hearing a note of recorded material, based entirely on a live performance that convinced the label they were witnessing something genuinely unprecedented. The combination of Page's guitar architecture, John Paul Jones's bass and arrangement instincts, John Bonham's physically overwhelming drumming, and Robert Plant's vocal range produced something that existing genre categories couldn't contain cleanly: too heavy for blues, too rooted for psychedelia, too raw for the progressive rock that was simultaneously emerging. 7. Beggars Banquet. The Rolling Stones made this record as a deliberate course correction after their Satanic Majesty's request. Their psychedelic album had been received with a critical skepticism that stung more than the band was willing to publicly admit. Brian Jones was deteriorating rapidly by this point. His drug problems having reduced his contributions to a fraction of what they had been, and the recording sessions were organized around his increasing absence rather than his participation. Keith Richards stepped fully into the creative leadership role that Jones had previously occupied, and the album's return to blues and roots influences reflected Richards' instincts more completely than anything the band had made before. Sympathy for the Devil opened the record with a samba rhythm, and Jagger narrating history from Satan's perspective, which was either the most audacious opening to a rock album ever recorded or a piece of calculated provocation, and the honest answer is probably both simultaneously. The original cover art was a photograph of a graffiti-covered bathroom wall that Decca Records refused to release, forcing a last-minute replacement that the band resented publicly and never fully accepted. If you're enjoying this one, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. 6. Blonde on Blonde. Bob Dylan recorded this double album in Nashville, at a moment when Nashville and rock music existed in entirely separate cultural universes that didn't acknowledge each other, and the decision to record there was either an act of genuine artistic curiosity or a deliberate provocation, depending on which version of the story you find most persuasive. The sessions ran through the night repeatedly, with Dylan arriving with lyrics written on scraps of paper and expecting the musicians, most of them seasoned Nashville session players, who had never encountered anything like him, to build arrangements around words that kept changing until the tape was rolling. Al Cooper, who played organ on Highway 61 Revisited, without technically knowing how to play organ, was present for many of the sessions and has described the atmosphere as simultaneously chaotic and oddly focused. Dylan operating on an internal logic that everyone else was simply trying to keep pace with. Visions of Johanna, which opens the second side, is by the assessment of many critics and musicians the single greatest piece of songwriting in the rock era. 6 minutes of imagery so dense and so precisely constructed that academics have been writing about it for 60 years without exhausting what's inside it. 5. Pet Sounds. Brian Wilson made this record in response to hearing Rubber Soul and feeling genuinely challenged in a way that he hadn't experienced before. Wouldn't it be nice if we were older than we would? Not threatened, but ignited, pushed towards something more ambitious than anything he had previously attempted. He worked largely without the rest of the band during the recording sessions, building the instrumental tracks with studio musicians while the other Beach Boys were on tour, and then bringing them back to add vocals to arrangements they hadn't been present to shape. The production used instruments that had never appeared on a rock record before: bicycle bells, Coca-Cola cans, dog whistles, a theremin assembled into orchestrations of extraordinary complexity that Capitol Records initially refused to release because they couldn't identify the commercial logic in what they were hearing. Paul McCartney heard the album and immediately told people it was the greatest thing he had ever heard, a response that directly accelerated the Beatles' work on what became Sgt. Pepper's. The irony that Pet Sounds was itself a response to Rubber Soul means that the two bands were essentially inspiring each other in a creative loop that elevated both of them beyond what either would have achieved independently. 4. The Doors. The Doors arrived with their debut album already fully formed in a way that most bands take years to achieve. Come on, baby, light my fire. Try to set the night on. Which was partly a function of how long they had been playing together in the clubs of Los Angeles before anyone offered them a record deal. Jim Morrison came to the sessions with lyrics he had been developing for years, rooted in his extensive reading of Blake, Nietzsche, and Rimbaud, and the band had rehearsed the arrangements so thoroughly that most of the album was recorded live in the studio with minimal overdubs. Light My Fire was 9 minutes long in its original album version, and the label demanded an edited single that the band resented but ultimately accepted, and the edited version went to #1 and introduced the Doors to an audience that then went back to the album to find what else was there. Ray Manzarek's keyboard bass lines, he played the bass parts with his left hand because the band had no bassist, gave the Doors a sound that was immediately identifiable and impossible to replicate without sounding like a direct imitation. Morrison's relationship with the press and with his own mythology was already complex by the time the debut came out, which meant the band was navigating questions about authenticity and performance from the very beginning of their commercial life. 3. Are you experienced? Jimi Hendrix had been playing in backing bands for years, behind Little Richard, the Isley Brothers, and others when Chas Chandler discovered him in a New York club in 1966 and immediately flew him to London to record. The British scene received Hendrix with an enthusiasm that America hadn't offered him yet, partly because the London audience was primed for exactly the kind of blues-rooted psychedelia he was developing.
Oh, shucks, vaccinated.
And partly because Eric Clapton and Pete Townshend, two of England's most celebrated guitarists, publicly declared themselves overwhelmed by what they were hearing, which is not the kind of endorsement the industry can manufacture. The album was recorded quickly and cheaply by later standards, but the production captured something that more expensive sessions might have smoothed away: the rawness of a musician operating at the absolute edge of what his instrument was capable of doing. Purple Haze, Foxy Lady, and Manic Depression arrived simultaneously as a statement so complete that it's almost impossible to imagine hearing any of them for the first time without understanding immediately that something genuinely new had entered the conversation. The album reached number 2 in the UK and broke the American market shortly after, and the Monterey Pop Festival performance that accompanied its release, where Hendrix set his guitar on fire and the audience sat in stunned silence, became one of the defining cultural images of the entire decade. 2. Abbey Road. This was recorded while the Beatles were actively disintegrating. The Let It Be sessions had already collapsed into acrimony, and the footage from those sessions was sitting in a vault, waiting to become evidence of how badly things had broken down. George Martin has described the Abbey Road sessions as the last time the band functioned as a genuine creative unit.
Tell you is you got to be free. Come together.
With everyone making a conscious decision to set aside the legal disputes and personal grievances long enough to make something worth leaving behind. The second side, medley, a suite of interconnected song fragments that flows across 15 minutes without a break, was Paul McCartney's idea, a way of finishing songs that the band had started but never completed by stitching them together into something larger than any of them could have been independently. Something by George Harrison became one of the album's most celebrated tracks and has since been described by Frank Sinatra as the greatest love song of the past 50 years, which represents a remarkable critical vindication for a songwriter who had spent years having his compositions treated as filler between Lennon and McCartney material. 1. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The Beatles spent 700 hours in the studio making this record.
He didn't notice that the lights had changed,
which was an almost incomprehensible investment of time and money for a pop album in 1967, and reflected a level of institutional support from MI that no other act on the planet could have negotiated. George Martin has described the sessions as unlike anything he had previously experienced, the band arriving each day with ideas that the available technology couldn't yet execute, and the engineers working backward from the desired sound to figure out whether it was physically possible to produce it. The concept of a fictional band performing a concert gave the album a structural frame that freed the Beatles from the constraints of their own identity, allowing them to experiment with arrangements and subject matter that Beatle John or Beatle Paul couldn't quite have gotten away with. Sgt. Pepper's Band absolutely could. The cover alone, designed by Peter Blake and featuring over 60 figures assembled in a collage, took 2 weeks to produce and cost more than most albums of the era cost to record in their entirety. A Day in the Life, which closes the album, remains by wide consensus one of the greatest pieces of music ever committed to tape. Lennon and McCartney, working in their separate creative modes and then handing the song to a full orchestra with instructions to start at their lowest note and end at their highest, producing a crescendo that physically vibrates the room when played at proper volume. The 1960s produced music that the decade itself could barely contain. These 10 albums didn't just document a cultural moment, they created one. The artists who made them were working without a map, and the fact that they found their way is still astonishing. Subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.